It's a pleasure to have Dr. Mara Karlin with us today. She is currently an assistant professor of the practice of strategic studies at Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as the associate director of strategic studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. So just from that list alone, she is quite the intellectual powerhouse. But in the past, she's also served in a variety of positions here at the department, most notably as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. At the Pentagon, she advised on policies concerning a variety of topics, including strategic planning, defense budgeting, and the regional affairs of Middle Eastern, European, and Asian states. Her new book, Building Militaries in Fragile States, Challenges for the United States, is the topic of her talk today, and it's a pleasure to turn the podium over to you, Dr. Karlin. Thank you.
Thank you. It is such a treat to be back here. I know those of you who spend every day here probably are looking at me like I'm a little bit crazy, but it really is. Time away from here is it's a place that is missed. So I'd really like to thank the OSD Historian's Office for welcoming me. I'll talk for about 25 minutes or so, tell you all a little bit about this book I wrote, and then we can have a dialogue, and I hope you'll tell me what you think is silly or stupid, what you agree with, what you disagree with. I'm used to graduate students being very honest and blunt, so I expect that from all of you. So this is not the book I intended to write. It is actually not the book I wanted to write. So the book I should have written was supposed to talk about what an awesome job I did when I was trying to build militaries in fragile states, right? That's what you sort of do with your DC book. Inconveniently, I started doing the research, and as you see, if you read the book, it kind of doesn't turn out that way. So let me tell you all a little bit about what I tried to do. As you all know, we have this problem, right? We have this problem of increased state fragility, proliferation of fragile states with the trappings of statehood, but they can't actually fulfill their number one job, which is to hold a monopoly on violence, as Max Weber tells us. So they cannot create internal security. And this fragility increasingly affects the United States. We see this post-World War II, we see this post-9/11. Just the nature of transnational threats means it is harder for the United States to avoid this fragility. But we don't want to deal with it ourselves, right? We don't want to send the US military to go and fix this problem for a bunch of different reasons. US sensitivity toward casualties, constrained fiscal environment, might be pretty expensive to go fight these wars. And if you've read the National Defense Strategy, which if you're sitting here, I sure hope you have, you know that it's all focused on competition with Russia and China. And so to actually focus on those things, one has to figure out how to cheaply stabilize fragile states in blood, treasure, and time. So how do we do it? Right? We delegate authority. We work by, with, and through others so that they can deal with these problems, and then the US military doesn't have to do so. There's a bunch of examples where that hasn't worked when we look across history. I'll just tell you a little bit about one. South Vietnam, mid-1950s. The US paid for years and years for the French effort there to build the South Vietnamese military, spent years trying to do so. Massive effort, $500 million in assistance, hundreds of people from the US military trying to do this. Yet South Vietnam's president, President Diem, reorganized the South Vietnamese military according to his preferences, prepared it for a conventional external fight with North Vietnam, left it ill-equipped for the growing communist insurgency at home. To make matters worse, the military's leadership was based on loyalty rather than merit. There was a pretty messed up system of promotion. The command and control was hideous. And when the security situation deteriorated in 1960, it was pretty clear South Vietnam's military was incapable of dealing with the growing insurgency. It was evident that the US had built this military for the wrong kind of threat. So I want you to just take a moment and imagine if that had worked. Imagine if the US had effectively built the South Vietnamese military. At a minimum, we'd have 58,000 Americans who would be here. we wouldn't have had that legacy of the Vietnam War if we had done this better. More recently, we've seen examples in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. If you were watching TV a couple of years ago, you saw very large swaths of the Iraqi army dissolve as ISIS ran across key cities in Iraq. You saw as more than $20 billion in US assistance and a decade plus of training also dissolved. As parts of the leadership disappeared, soldiers fled, and about 3 divisions of equipment were abandoned. So I hope you're convinced that this is an important issue that we need to care about. What I did in this book was effectively say, when, why, and under what circumstances can the US military be more effective when we try to do these sorts of things, when we try to build militaries in fragile states. And I looked at the nature of American involvement in building the military, the parameters, the purpose, the people involved, and I looked at the external threat environment. What else is happening outside of this bilateral relationship? The goal, of course, is we want a more enforced and sustainable monopoly on violence that other people are exerting, not the US military. So my findings, after looking at a number of cases, historical and more contemporary, is that the US is more likely to succeed in building a military in a fragile state when we get involved in the partner states' sensitive military affairs and when antagonistic external actors play a diminishing role. You're like, that's great, I don't understand what that means in English. So let's talk about what that actually means in English. So what it actually means is that we need to do 2 crucial things when we are embarking on these efforts to build a military in a fragile state. Number 1, we have to acknowledge that like all state building endeavors, these are political, not technical exercises. Distancing from key political issues wastes time, effort, and resources. It is fundamentally flawed. I hope you're recognizing that that's actually pretty provocative. I'm saying we need to muck around in a military's knickers, and we need to do that pretty actively, right? In fact, our biggest problem with trying to work with these militaries is that the United States is reluctant to weigh in on higher order questions of mission, of organizational structure, and personnel. Issues that profoundly affect a military's capacity and capability, but are often just seen as too sensitive to touch. Instead, we often focus narrowly on training and equipment, right? What kind of training did they get? What sort of equipment? How quickly do we get it there to help them in that fight? Instead, what I'm saying is we need to take a different stance, right? We need to be comfortable dealing with all of these sensitive issues. And there's also an inside story there too, right? So how the US policymaking community thinks about building these militaries. We need to seriously think about the purpose and the scope of the US role, the mission of this military, its leadership, and who is working on it from the US side. I'll walk through an example in a moment that will make this a lot more clear. But effectively, the big point here is the United States has more influence than it thinks it does, because it is often providing irreplaceable military assistance and support. So big finding, recognize this is a political effort, be comfortable mucking around in a military sensitive affairs. Don't just focus on training, don't just focus on equipment. Second finding, do not ignore the destabilizing potential of third parties that pose a serious challenge to a newly equipped military. There are third parties that often see it useful or it is in their interest to have a weak country next to them. They have a vested interest in opposing policies to actually have a stable country that can exert its sovereignty. So it's dangerous to view what's going on through a bilateral lens of the United States and the partner it's working with. And when and where possible, the United States needs to be comfortable marshaling its tools to limit all of this external meddling, perhaps enhancing border security, going to the United Nations to leverage international pressure, or even in extreme cases, attacking the third parties themselves. So let's walk through an example. I want you to go all the way back to just after World War II to picture Greece. Now, this is not the Greece of your summer vacation or your honeymoon. This is a very different Greece. Post-World War II, you have a country that has been ravaged. The infrastructure is destroyed. The landscape is a mess. Rampant starvation and disease. 300,000 people have died only from starvation. The military is in terrible shape. It's old, its morale is low, it has terrible equipment. Dean Acheson has the best quote about this. He says, Greece was in the position of a semi-conscious patient on the critical list whose relatives and physicians had been discussing whether his life could be saved. So I hope when you're thinking about Greece right now as I'm speaking, you're picturing Syria today, if you will, right? A pretty hideous, dysfunctional situation. And Greece is fighting communist guerrillas at this moment that are getting help from Albania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. So what happens? The United States launches this massive effort to build the Greek military. And it's pretty extraordinary when you look at the parameters of the US assistance. US involvement is extremely deep. The US works with the military to figure out what its mission is. It's focused on internal defense and make sure that both sides are clear on what that mission looks like. The US works to reorganize the Greek military to ensure that the organizational structure is actually tied to what that mission looks like, fighting communist guerrillas rather than foreign armies. And the US is training and equipping that military, providing tactical and strategic advice, planning operations together, and making a number of organizational and leadership changes. So let's spend a moment on the personnel changes, because I'll tell you, when I was researching this book, this is the thing that struck me the hardest. The US made sure that capable military leaders were appointed to the right position, overseeing a complete overhaul of the Greek military's personnel, appointing a new chief of staff, compelling all of the Army's lieutenant generals except for one to resign, facilitating the promotion and placement of 8 major generals, encouraging the removal of division and corps commanders who were reluctant or incapable of supporting the broader strategy. That's incredible when you think about it, right? This willingness to really muck around in personnel. And yet, as all of us know, right, people are policy. If you don't have the right people in the right position, how can we actually expect to be terribly effective? So this is incredible, right? Moreover, you see a real unity of US vision in the field and in Washington. So the first fellow leading the effort, Major General William Livesey, is pretty quiescent, he's pretty dull, he doesn't have the support of the leadership here, and so he gets pushed out and replaced by a fellow, Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, who's capable, who's experienced, who had a great record in World War II, who's focused on lessons learned. Above all, he is committed to keeping those in Athens and those in Washington on the same page. He gets why you need unity of vision among the Americans. He gets the importance of the inside the family dynamics, if you will. And anytime that you start to see divisions among those inside either Embassy Athens or vis-a-vis those in Washington, you see real leadership by President Truman himself to ensure that that is the case. Indeed, at one point, even pushing out the ambassador, because the ambassador at the time doesn't recognize how important it is to have this inside the family dynamic. Now, this idea of people, you'll see, is one that I push really hard, right? It's not just in the partner military, but it's also within the US military, the person running this effort. I've told you a little bit about James Van Fleet and how charismatic he was, how he had the right experience, how he was able to make this a successful effort. I can give you a lot of examples that are not that case. So if you remember when I was talking about South Vietnam a couple minutes ago. So the fellow running that effort, hanging Sam Williams is pretty much like the most toxic leader I've ever read about. I suspect that as I'm describing him, some of you will have like nightmares about other leaders that you've worked for. So this guy was relieved of command in World War II due to incompetence. He was demoted. His biographer described him as causing ulcers, mid-career burnout, heart attacks, divorces, the resignations of commissioned officers of the regular army. So not great, right? This is not the command climate that you want to work in whatsoever. And you see this through the effort to try to build the South Vietnamese military, right? When folks working in the military assistance and advisory group start to tell him, hey, I don't think things are going well, he shuts them up. He doesn't want to hear that. And you see a real shift when you go through the archives of them saying, hey, maybe things aren't going well, to everything is butterflies and unicorns. We are doing a superb job building the South Vietnamese military, which of course like explodes a couple years later, so there's no doubt that that's wrong. So Williams not only has this pretty toxic command climate amongst those working for him to build the South Vietnamese military, he does not get along at all with the US ambassador and criticizes him over and over. He takes criticism of the partner military's leader personally. He says, I don't want to hear people referring to my friend, President Diem, as an SOB. In his view, you can't actually criticize or pressure the partner military's leadership. He's on a different page than those in Washington, who actually, to their credit, recognize that this is a military that needs to worry about internal defense. He does what he wants. And of course, that doesn't turn out to work so hot. I can unfortunately give you lots of examples where that is the case, where there's not the right leader in this position. When we look at another example that I explored, Lebanon in the early 1980s, we see one person who tries to get the head of the Lebanese military to conduct a coup that is not US policy. We see another person who tries to get the head of the Lebanese military, when he gets pushed out, tries to give him access to all these covert weapons caches. Also not US policy. So you see why having people in country who aren't aligned with how Washington thinks is actually pretty problematic. Let's talk a little bit more about Greece. Another key element that you see in Greece, beyond a willingness to really muck about in what's happening with the Greek military, unity of vision in the field and in Washington, is you see serious discussions about what it means to be a co-combatant. You see these discussions both in Athens and also in Washington. A real interagency process where there's regular assessment and honest assessment, not PowerPoint assessment, that says, so how well is this going, right? Is this program actually fulfilling its purpose? Are we adjusting it as the situation evolves? And serious debates about the appropriate role of the US military, including when and where the United States might consider becoming a co-combatant, right? These are important questions, and yet I can give you all sorts of examples where those questions aren't asked. Another great example, if we go back to Lebanon in the 1980s, no doubt this crowd is really familiar with the story of the Peacekeepers in Lebanon. Well, they're not really peacekeepers, right? They are there for presence, they are there for stability, and yet you see real disagreement among senior US policymakers over their role and the scope of their role, in particular, the extent to which the United States should directly support Lebanon's military in combat operations. President Reagan wasn't willing to break bureaucratic impasses. There was a lack of agreement as to why the US was building the Lebanese military and why the Marines were there. And so you get a situation where the Marines think they are there as peacekeepers for stability and presence, and yet the USS New Jersey is firing on the Syrian military and firing on militias inside Lebanon. Indeed, it's really discomfiting when you read President Reagan's diary, and he talks in his diary, the night the USS New Jersey starts firing, he says, this still falls under the heading of self-defense. Well, that's obviously not the case for those who are being attacked. And so it shouldn't be a surprise when we see the Marine barracks bombing in October '83 and other efforts. So this real misunderstanding, if you will, by adversaries about the US role. There can also be a real misunderstanding about the US role by those we're trying to work with. This idea of our willingness to become a co-combatant. A great example of this is a couple of years ago, also in Lebanon, where we saw Hezbollah take over wide swaths of Beirut, and senior Lebanese political and military officials calling the Pentagon and saying, are you going to send the Marines? What they didn't realize was we weren't going to send the Marines. That was never going to happen. They had a profound misunderstanding of how willing the US was to work with their military and where we saw our lines. So they were shocked and flabbergasted, and that was really problematic, as you can imagine, for years to come. The other piece I'll quickly talk about for Greece is this idea of the external threat environment. So because the US is willing to get involved in all these sensitive military affairs and has this unity of vision, when you start to see changes in the external threat environment, the newly equipped military is able to actually deal with it in an effective way. So in Greece, we see a situation where Yugoslavia starts to diminish its support for communist insurgents, and then the Greek military, because of all these reforms, is now able to actually successfully exert its control across Greece. And within only a couple of years, you now see a military that had defeated its opposition and was actually able to have a serious internally defended country. What's amazing to me is that the American investment here consists almost entirely of treasure. It's a couple $100 million and 4 casualties for a successful program. That's pretty extraordinary when you think about it, when you compare it to a bunch of efforts we've run. So you might say, this is all great. I would really like for this to happen. I want to completely transform how we work with partner militaries in fragile states by getting involved in their sensitive military affairs. But what if we're not dealt a good hand? What if everything I've just said to you is butterflies and unicorns and can't actually happen? Maybe this is infeasible because the partner state doesn't want to discuss any of these issues, because they don't trust us, because they have a different agenda, because they're uncertain about the American commitment, or frankly, they just think they're going to get USA no matter what, right? So if that is the case, what do you do? Or let's say the US is unwilling to crack down on external actors because we have higher priorities with them than we do with this partner state. So what do we do there? In those scenarios, I'd ask you to make a clear-eyed assessment about the goals and the likely outcomes of US military assistance. And in doing that, you'll conclude one of two things. You'll conclude that we should still move forward with this program. We should try to build this foreign military, but we recognize this is light security sector reform. And look, limited train and equip programs can have a useful purpose. They can give the US military some good practice. You can gather some intelligence, might help professionalize the military a little bit, maybe get some operational cooperation on mutually agreed threats. That's terrific, as long as we recognize that limited US involvement will have a limited impact. We are never going to give them all the training and the equipment they want in the amount of time they want to satisfy their desires. So you can decide that. You can say, we're still going to go forward with this program. We recognize it will have a limited impact. And that is fine, as long as one is clear-eyed and sober. Or you might decide that the costs outweigh the benefits. And in those cases, I'd ask that you submit to reality and deal with the problem some other way, rather than just throwing good money after bad. So I look forward to taking your questions. What can I tell you? Assuming I've kept you all awake. Yes, please.
A couple things. I kind of think your title could be divided into 2 pieces: building militaries in fragile states. There's lots of lectures across the way over there from the Applied Distance Laboratory. There was a speaker they had back, I think it was late last fall, it was from USAID, and talked about building institutions in fragile states and how it takes like 7 years or more to build institutions. Now it's that the military is only one of the institutions you need to make fragile state less fragile. And there are other ones, judicial systems, agricultural systems, that are equally important to increase the stability. And so focusing just on military doesn't necessarily fix the problem.
I couldn't agree more. And let's build on your point. You know, there's challenges there with both the us and the them. On the us side, we see this on Capitol Hill every day. People want to give you all lots of money, and they want to defenestrate the State Department, right? I really like the idea of a massive state building effort, institution building across the board. I couldn't agree more. And yet, I have seen very few US governments that are willing to take that approach. So that's the us part of the problem. There's also a them part of the problem, right? Oftentimes militaries are really excited to work with all of you and much less excited to hear about how they need to transform their judiciary. Now, ideally, we would use the work in building that military as a hook to get into transforming their judiciary, right? So that we have a situation where people feel like they have a government that is responsive to them, that is operating by a legal framework, all of those good things. Absolutely 100%. And indeed, I think this is one that is more operationalizable potentially, right? So to the extent you all are working with these militaries and are willing to talk to them at the political military level about how this needs to be broader than just a military, that is all really good. I mean, you could even push your argument further and say, maybe we shouldn't do anything at all, because how problematic is it to have a country with utterly feckless institutions except for the guys with guns? That is not an ideal scenario, right? So I think you are spot on. We need to see profound changes in both the us versus them categories. Until that happens, it's up to you all to try to do things that maybe you're not terribly capable of doing. Yes?
interested to know if you, militaries in different countries have different relationships to the political establishments, and political leadership, and there have been instances, I don't know if you looked at Latin America, where the United States military assistance ends up involving the United States into other countries' internal politics in divisive and troubling ways. I wonder, did you look at Latin America at all?
So I didn't look at Latin America. There's been some really good writing on El Salvador, in particular in the U.S. effort to build El Salvador's military in the 1980s. And then, of course, Colombia is the sort of example everyone wants to use. To be frank, I didn't look at Colombia because it seemed to me that given sort of the narco picture, it skewed both in the situation in the country because you saw such massive amounts of funding. Moreover, it skewed U.S. domestic politics, right? The war on drugs, it kind of represents such a touchstone, if you will, and sort of forces folks in Congress in particular to be interested in ways that they might not be. So I thought Colombia was more of an anomaly. But what I'm hearing from your question is this idea of getting involved in all sorts of other political issues, right? Because you could take my argument a step further. What I'm trying to say is we need to get involved in the military's sensitive issues, because at the end of the day, a whole bunch of training and a whole bunch of equipment is not going to transform these militaries, right? It will be these sensitive issues. And what I'm hearing from you is, well, would you not take it a step further, right? At what point are you actually trying to get involved in all of a country's sensitive affairs?
Yeah, I've looked at examples where the United States had developed very close relationships with Latin American navies and armies. And those are political institutions in certain countries, and they have political agendas within the political establishment of those countries, and those countries, they've got particular angles in those countries' territorial disputes with neighbors and things like this. And so the United States Navy, for example, has had to confront circumstances. There are cases in the past where it's got to tell its officers, you can't be involved if this country goes to war with its neighbor. And so I just...
Absolutely. Well, and look, at a minimum, there's kind of utility and cognizance of those dynamics, of recognizing who you're supporting and the effects it has. I'll give you a quick contemporary example. Right now in Lebanon, the Special Forces community is working very closely with the Ranger Regiment in Lebanon. These are sort of the most capable folks in the Lebanese military. And that's great. They do a pretty decent job of fighting and winning. Now, the problem is they're overwhelmingly Maronite Christian. And this is a country that has 18 different confessional groups. So if it turns out that the ones that you work with the most, give the best stuff to, and are the most effective, happen to all be from one cohort, you're actually playing a bit with some pretty sensitive affairs. So at a minimum, recognize that, and then decide, eyes wide open, am I okay kind of having that effect or not? Yeah, absolutely, yes, please.
Of course, in the case of Greece, maybe it was almost too effective because by the 1960s, the military had taken over the government with the junta, and by 1974, nearly fought the war between NATO allies over Cyprus. And I was wondering, what are the long-term dangers, essentially, of separating? And you talked about this some, but making the military very effective without making it loyal to democratic institutions or institutions. How could you go about doing that for the long term? Would Germany, for example, be a better example of long-term military troops?
So you're bringing up a really important point. You know, the challenge with the long-term perspective is that on the whole, we're looking at pretty hideous examples, right? These are not like places that are largely stable, where we have a plethora of delightful options. It's effectively, we deal with this problem in this way over the coming years, or there will be a point where we're sending the U.S. military. And I think it's really important to sort of operate under that chapeau. This is kind of the land of bad options, and do you want worse or sort of catastrophic? Under these circumstances, to me, Greece is a great success. Right now, yes, 20 years from that period of time, I have to worry about how inappropriately they're acting with their political leadership, absolutely, but I'd rather deal with that than have to send the U.S. military to fight a war there. These are bad options, and I just think it's important that we kind of recognize that element of it. But you're right to take the long-term perspective, absolutely. Yes.
Based on 20 years of experience with that foreign office, I think two takeaways are you don't have the political buy-in from most government. Those will fund institutions, you're not going to get anywhere. And two, you have to really, with small countries, avoid the trap of them thinking that everything we say is right. You know, just giving the north south to everything you want to do. And that way thinking through what the actual situation is and how to fight the rest.
Absolutely, and what I'm hearing from you is one has to be comfortable having really frank conversations, right? Both the inside the U.S. government or the inside the family conversations, but also with the partner military. If we think their mission is one thing and they think their mission is something else, and none of us are getting beyond PowerPoint to actually pull that apart, that's a real problem. And I found this a lot when I was doing the field research and the interviews for this. Yes, at the grand strategic level, we agreed on exerting the country's monopoly on violence. But we never actually talked about what that meant operationally, right? And so be willing to at least look amongst yourselves and say, hey, we got that we have a different view than them. We're still going to go forward for ABC reasons. Absolutely fine. Or at least then raise it with them. This shouldn't be just a talking point conversation. I at least am consistently surprised, and this is both in research and my practical experience, by how much countries want to know what the U.S. is thinking. We saw this as great examples over the last few years with U.S. efforts to inform defense strategies by the UK, Poland, Germany, and Canada. And I think that at least is at least to me a leading indicator that we should be a little bit more comfortable sharing our views. Not least because we have a real interest in how these things turn out, right? We have certain expectations of what countries' military capabilities will look like and what they'll be able to do.
Well, I appreciate your talk today, and I'm interested in a lot of what we're discussing here are really principal agent problems. And my question is based on the case that you looked at, whether there are successful tactics for dealing with principal agent problems, and in particular, what the development community would have once called conditionality or compacts. I think they want more, the partner wants more than simply knowing what the U.S. is thinking. It's, I think, what we want out of them over the long term. And of course, this risks getting into these sorts of neo-colonial type dynamics that historically we've shied away from. But I'm interested in your thoughts as to whether that's a kind of applicable framework thinking about this.
I think that is useful, and you are spot on about us historically shying away from them, right? I suspect that as you were hearing me kind of discuss the book, you were cringing a little bit, right? How uncomfortable to think that we should say to a country's military, actually, maybe this isn't the right leader. So I hope that you were a little bit uncomfortable, and I hope that you'll sort of have this in an ankle-biting way for the rest of the day. Right? Effectively, though, there are other ways of doing this, right? I'm not suggesting that the U.S. military should now become some sort of colonial power, kind of blustering in and saying to countries, wow, the chief of staff of your military is a moron, and, right? I mean, that's not useful. Instead, what you would want to do is you'd want to have an understanding of the goodness and the badness, if you will, the chief of staff. Also, what about at the lower levels, right? Who's sort of doing what and why, and then help them understand at the political level why maybe change would be worthwhile. So I think there's a big question as to how one does that, and the colonial analogies aren't great for that reason. Because frankly, and this is why I think Iraq and Afghanistan are a little bit of special cases, right? You have this massive US presence for many, many years. All sorts of things happen when you have this massive presence in all different ways, and not just military, but civilian also. So how do we do it in a not blustery way, I think is absolutely useful. In terms of conditionality, there is some research that it can work. How it happens matters a lot. And of course, we have the challenge that kind of Congress is in one place and the department is often in another place, and how do you bridge that? So if we took just one really interesting example of today, Yemen, right? So you have in Yemen a situation where CENTCOM is trying to get the Emirati military and the Saudi military to come together and ideally to figure out how to fight a little bit more effectively. Whereas on the Hill, you have some very strident opposition to any cooperation with the Saudi and Emirati militaries in Yemen, whether it's refueling, whether it's giving them munitions, you name it. So trying to push on conditionality will be a real challenge, just inevitably given our system. And I might spend a quick moment. I was down at SOCOM, CENTCOM, and Joint Special Ops University and got a great question when I was talking about the book a couple weeks ago. Effectively, they said, but well, look at our system, right? We have elections every few years. We have these changes that are happening. How can people even think about us being effective in terms of conditionality or longevity when we're just constantly changing? And I do think it's important that we acknowledge that. Yes, it's frustrating for us. It's frustrating for the partner military. It sows confusion among our adversaries and our frenemies. But that is also our system, right? It's a system of checks and balances. It is a system designed to constrain action. And it will never move as quickly as we want it to. I'll give you all just one quick example along these lines. So the Lebanese military fights its first real war ever in 2007, and it's fighting the Sunni extremists in this Palestinian refugee camp, Nahal al-Bared. And this is kind of fantastic at one level of optics, right? You've got a leader from one group pushing a military led by someone from another group to fight a third group. This is great. People are really, really excited about it in Washington. I put myself in this category. And we race assistance. For one of the only times assistance actually gets there when we want it to get there, for various reasons, some of which are a little bit sketchy but are talked about in the book. And what happens is you see something like 40 C-17s and C-130s landing at Beirut International Airport. Assistance is being loaded from there onto helos, going right to the camp to help the Lebanese military fight. I mean, it's great, right? In every way. Doesn't sing whatsoever for the Lebanese. You have the chief of staff of Lebanon's military saying, the Americans didn't give us anything. It's as though they told us die first and assistance will follow. That was heartbreaking. If you turned on Lebanese television, you saw sitcoms showing people dressed up as US generals handing out toy socks and paper airplanes. And even worse, you heard the Lebanese political leadership talking about all the great assistance they got from the Russians, which was not even 1/40th of what the US had done. Another example, the US showed the Lebanese military certain intelligence for the very first time. Big deal, actually led to some real successes in this fight. All the Lebanese leadership did was complain that they didn't get to keep the intelligence. So under these rubrics, that our system is not designed to move quickly. We're never going to give them the training and all the equipment they want in the right amount of time. That's just what it is. I know we all want to change acquisition. We want to do all this sort of great stuff that Capitol Hill is forcing on y'all. That is superb. But fundamentally, these will be sort of one standard deviation left or right at best. Other questions? Yes, please.
Well, to build on to that question about Greek military military. So just looking at other successes, South Korea, Taiwan, it seems like where there is effective building, you have a generation and a half of authoritarianism, which one's the democratic country. Do we accept it? And I think the examples show that happens. Where do we accept that that's going to happen and democracy will come, or is there a way to form an effective military that also has that way democratic power?
It's a really interesting thought. I haven't done, so my academic answer is I haven't done the research to show whether that hypothesis is correct. So worth looking at. I might make a little bit of an awkward comment, which is South Korea a success? Because it seems to me having 28,500 US troops there is actually not what we want, right? The whole point is that I want them to be able to deal with it so that, in fact, you have a US military that can focus on other things, right? Anyone here wearing an Army uniform knows the strain that the 28,500 has on the Army and what strain that planning has more broadly. So at one level, yes, that has led to a relative situation of peace. At another level, I wouldn't call it kind of the penultimate success for those reasons. Now, what I'm hearing from you, though, is, all right, so do we accept a bit of authoritarianism? I think that's a really interesting and uncomfortable question for us to try to get into and to do some real research on. My instinct is probably yes, but I say that without having researched it. Yes, please.
Jimmy, focus just a little bit. John Noggle agrees with you on your assessment of Williams and there's studies primarily on the Army as a learning institution and proves it failed. Do you think that, it's a DoD now, going back down, would you say that the DoD has improved as a learning institution or fall back on
let me give you two answers. Answer one is I think on this issue in particular, there is some tremendous energy, including by some people in this room, to try to actually reconceptualize and rethink how to do this stuff. That is fantastic. I mean, I can go back only 10 years where I look at how we were building militaries in fragile states, and it was a whole lot of Excel spreadsheets in terms of what did we give them with equipment, what do we give them with training. And I think there's a real sophistication and maturity that is infused into what the department is doing these days on that. So kudos, that is fantastic. What I'm also hearing from your question, though, is this idea of a learning institution. And what I might suggest is looking at that paragraph in the National Defense Strategy on professional military education. I will just say anecdotally, I have been floored, A, by how blunt that paragraph was, and B, by how, at least in my constant anecdotal discussions, everyone in professional military education institutions tells me it's not about them. That seems really curious. Now, let me be clear, that's anecdote, not data, but it's a whole lot of anecdotes, because I'm sort of constantly speaking to these sorts of organizations, and I talk a lot, but then that's the one question I ask them, and on the whole, they say, no, it's not about us, everything's going really well here. Well, that's curious, and how can you be a learning organization if your sort of kind of key education institutions maybe aren't taking that approach? So I leave your question with a very big question mark for myself. Yes, please.
So you keep saying we when you talk about the DoD working with other countries. Who is the we? Curious who you think that we is. Is it protocols? Is it folks in uniforms? Is it civilians? And do we have the right expertise?
That's a really superb question. Who is the we? I mean, I suppose at one level it is the proverbial we. What does that mean in practice? I think you need strong leadership from the OSD team, from the policy team, and I think we see a lot of that from some folks in this room to really ensure that the right people are doing the right thing. I think it does require some serious understanding from the COCOMs in particular, a recognition by the services, of course, an understanding by those at state, so the we is actually bigger than all of us here, right, by those at state. So when you get an ambassador who really understands the power of those folks in his embassy or in his country at that moment working with the military, that's incredible leverage. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. I'd also push this point to those working on the NSC staff, right? So how are they thinking about the knitting together of a serious interagency process? Let's just use one quick example of this co-combatant idea, right? Which is no minor issue, right? Are we is the U.S. military in a country to build their military, to serve as a co-combatant, or both, right? Those are not insignificant questions. And while some of the answer comes from here, some of the answer also comes from the NSC staff. So the perfect example today, of course, is the 2,000 U.S. military personnel in Syria. What are they doing? They're there as a presence, they're there for stability. Well, the U.S. is also involved in a pretty kinetic effort there. If we're confused in Washington, which I would argue we are, just looking at sort of the last few months of public statements on what U.S. military is doing in Syria, if we're confused in Washington, I can promise you Tehran, the Assad regime, Hezbollah are also a little bit confused. And at some point that doesn't turn out as well as one wants. Yes, please.
So, it's a few things. First, an observation. Your energy and passion is definitely making this a very interesting dialogue. So thank you so much.
Thanks, I really appreciate that.
And so the question, and you mentioned it, talking about doing this cheap. Well, that's kind of desire. I think you mentioned Vietnam, Iraq, and Syria. There's one thing for sure, the U.S. does not do things cheap in those areas. So, and then you mentioned the Lebanon example, where the Americans did a whole lot, but the Russians got all the credit. And so my question is, I'm not really interested in yes or no, but more your assessment. Do we do too much for these nations? And is it embodied in our framework of open-ended commitments, conditions-based, and this is going to take a long time, 10, 20, 30 years? I mean, do we already sign ourselves up for an extremely expensive and not fruit-bearing outcome?
That's really an issue worth pondering, right? And there's multiple parts, I think, to this interesting question you're asking, right? Do we try to do too much vis-a-vis the partner military? Do we also try to do too much, and by here I mean sort of we, the defense enterprise. Do we also try to do too much vis-a-vis the other parts of the interagency? And that's a toughie, right? Because at one level, it is so easy to say, hey, that is not DOD's job, right? And DOD is not good at sort of X or Y, and state will come in or 8 will come in. and they'll fix it. And yet at another level, we all know how well that whole of government thing has turned out, right? Not perhaps as well as one might have liked. And so I think this is a kind of awkward and uncomfortable issue to really get into. Do you acknowledge that the rest of the interagency won't show up? You might actually need to acknowledge that. And do you acknowledge then that you all will be put into positions of doing things that you're actually not terribly good at? Yeah, I think probably you do need to accept that. Now what that means inside Washington versus what it means vis-a-vis the partner military is different. So with the country trying to actually be the ones to kind of on our own make a situation with security and stability, well, that's pretty questionable depending on the situation, right? I mean, this is where Iraq and Afghanistan are just not great examples, right? The US military went in and invaded both of those countries. I don't care how you feel about that, right? But that's empirical, that's factual, right? And so, of course, the US military had to play a key role in stability and security for a very long period of time. I don't want us to get to that situation in these examples, right? I want us to have the situation where the US military works effectively with a partner military for better or worse over a period of time so that we're not sending 100,000 people to now go and actually try to secure that country. So I think about what that means, I guess, inside Washington, vis-a-vis the partner military, and I think under many circumstances what you're suggesting is actually pretty spot on. And there's a little bit of an Afghan good enough, if you will, situation that one has to get accustomed to. Other questions? Yes, please.
As someone who has been in academia and when you was now back in such as yourself, how do you address the policy theory gap where you have academics trying to address policy issues and policymakers, but it's still the work the other way around, where you're trying to address the gap that academics have issued several recommendations, suggestions to address policy issues such as this, but for whatever reason, policymakers are still on the set of bureaucratic constraints that focus on one way and don't really bring in other outside thoughts.
Absolutely. I mean, so one of the challenges I found as someone now living in the academic world where I'm not necessarily totally comfortable, to be frank, the barriers to entry are just so high, right? So you all have probably read really superb, thoughtful memos that are kind of short and pithy and in English. And yet academia actually doesn't like that idea. They try to do the exact opposite. So I will continually read things that I, as a PhD, cannot understand. And that's seen as a good thing in academia. That's a real problem, right? So you've got two entirely different worlds where people aren't even starting off speaking the same language. And by same language, I don't mean like military acronyms. I just mean English, right? The ability for a marginally smart person to actually understand what is happening. So your biggest problem, just to start with academia, is not actually translating things in a way that you all, and myself included, can understand. Your next biggest problem is barriers to entry in terms of understanding how things get done, right? What academics want to do is look for the most sort of exquisite way to understand a research question and then play it out. The idea of being practical is actually not only not prioritized in most of academia, it's actually not seen as a good thing, right? And so the notion, I mean, to me as someone who sort of has policymaking in my blood, the idea that any of you are interested in my book is like just, I'm giddy and sort of overwhelmed with excitement, right? That is not the case in most of academia, not least because folks get concerned, well, what if what I'm suggesting is wrong? You all will go do that, you'll screw something up, there will be all these really bad implications, or what if we start having dialogues and what you say shapes what I think? Well, now I'm being unfairly influenced by those who are in policy-making positions. That's all dangerous. Next thing you know, academics go back into their tiny bubbles. So all of these reasons, I think, make it really hard for traditional academics to actually give you all things they're sort of useful. And that's really unfortunate. Now, there are anomalies, of course. I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS. All my students dream of being all of you. So those are the folks who I think recognize the importance of bridging this. But there are more exceptions than actual reality. And to that, I say such as it is. I'll give you just one really quick anecdote that illuminated this for me. There's something known as the International Studies Association. This is sort of the group of all sorts of people interested in the world, international security, foreign policy, etc. In academia, they get together once a year to sort of talk about everyone's research. And And so a couple years back, they asked me to kind of come in and talk about how to talk to policymakers. And my distinct memory was how astonished, flabbergasted, and frustrated people were when I said that they should try to actually write their findings in maybe 3 pages or less, right? So at that moment, it was pretty clear that this just wasn't going to work. So it is what it is. I'm really sorry. As someone trying to bridge these gaps, I'll do what I can to help them get it. But it's hard, and I will say, to throw them also a bone, policymaking world is really complicated, right? You all understand bureaucratic dynamics. I mean, most folks in academia, when they read about sort of bureaucratic dynamics, they think that's just sort of a thing that exists that isn't terribly important. I suspect each of you could sit down and dissertate for hours about the dynamics that are influencing your work and why your great idea isn't getting done because of this service or that COCOM or some other issue, right? You know that that's actually like the lifeblood of what happens here, and that's just pretty orthogonal to them. Yes, hopefully a question I can give a more inspiring answer to.
So you referenced that there was, as far back as the last decade, this focus on spreadsheets and how much we train, how much we spend, how much we provide, which I think partially may be just the approach, but it's also really easy to quantify, and it's really easy to show the hill, this is the progress that's being made. So how do you, with this kind of more diffuse, more nebulous concept of influencing the sensitive issues, how do you quantify that and sell it to the people who come in it?
Absolutely. But I'm going to focus on the first part of your question, which is how do you quantify it, right? So the selling to the hill, we've all been there where you have to sell something to the hill. You're going to figure out the story you need to tell, and you will then tell that to the hill. Please do not mistake that for serious and rigorous thinking. Because it's not, right? And that's okay. It's a sell job, right? You want to work on this great program to build Pakistan's military. That's super. You're going to talk to those who actually hold the purse strings about why they should do it. That is not an honest inside the family conversation. It just isn't. And that's okay. These are different discussions. Don't mistake, I got to go to the hill next week. Let's figure out what we're going to say as your answer for how you're actually going to work with that military and why you're doing it. So I actually have a whole list inside the book of questions that one should think about that are more qualitative in nature. So get a little bit comfortable not having the numbers and saying, well, we did 10 JSETs and we gave them $300 million worth of equipment, therefore they're going to fight and win against X bad actor. So get away from that. And instead think about, where are they fighting? How are those engagements actually turning out? And why? If there's a whole lot of quiet across most of the provinces of a country, that may be because people have stopped choosing to fight because the military is too scared, right? So actually get into the issues, if you will, get into those nuances and figure out, what does the military think its mission is? What do we think its mission is? What do those engagements look like? Are there any engagements to speak of? Are they improving in these? What have we encouraged them to do? Have they done those things or not, and why not? So as I hope you're hearing, an Excel spreadsheet won't give you the answers. It might be the starting point of a conversation, but it's really going to be that conversation where folks are going to say, okay, look, we finally got them fighting because we've given them kind of mobility, we've given them ammo, we've given them the capabilities to start fighting. Turns out they're willing to start doing it, but they're doing a terrible job. All right, let's look at that and let's look at why that's the case. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So what are your recommendations for DoD, the broader United States government, how to better organize, better prepare to take these tasks on? What do you recommend?
Absolutely. So I'd hesitate to offer kind of massive reorg questions.
Oh, please do.
I guess my theory on reorganization is you're just moving chess pieces around, and while you will get some sort of marginal benefit, you will also make kind of new gaps and seams. And so kind of recognize that. Sometimes it's worthwhile, but oftentimes it's much less worthwhile. For those of you who work in OSD policy, I've seen sort of this wonderful, massive sheet that shows all of the different reorgs that OSD policy has gone into. That's interesting. That's also not great necessarily, because all the energy you'll kind of put toward getting the perfect org structure will take a lot of time, take a lot of energy, and create new problems. So given that, I think there are a lot of this is really a reconceptualization. right? A willingness to take a lot of the steps, frankly, that I think you all are in the throes of taking that sort of weren't there years and years ago, to have this more qualitative look, to be more comfortable with these sorts of assessments that get beyond the actual numbers is key. I do think you need someone willing, and this sort of entity probably resides somewhere in OSD, but potentially in joint staff, to actually show the winners and losers, which countries to prioritize, which countries not to prioritize. It also seems to me that the ability to get folks on generally one set of talking points is probably good. The services do so much with various countries, and oftentimes I think it can be hard for them to know kind of where OSD or joint staff's head is in terms of working with that country. There had been this good question earlier about kind of working, what if this Navy has kind of one view, et cetera, kind of helping folks recognize that as an entity are, I think, all goodness. At a bare minimum, just being willing to say, what are we trying to get out of this? How do we know when we've achieved it? What is our role here? That to me is actually a huge success. So I think we have just a moment left if there's one final question. Yes, please.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why Greece was willing to accept, this level of intervention, and the extent to which you think those conditions can be duplicated or encouraged in other countries now.
I've thought a lot about this question, and it seems to me, I can give you a bunch of answers, right? I can say, well, there were the right people at the right time, and President Truman was really obsessed with this idea because he was using it to help convince the American people. I'm sorry that we've been at war for most of the last 30 years. We're actually gonna have to go get involved in this Cold War too. So I give you all of these answers. It seems to me the most compelling one is not least that they were desperate. They recognized that the situation was really problematic and they needed someone to help. And the U.S. was there and the U.S. was willing to do so. So I think that was the anchor, and then all of these other pieces that the U.S. did correctly. And look, there were still bumps in the relationship. I mean, there were huge fights between those working with the Greek military and the U.S. side and the Greeks about building their army. The Greeks really wanted this massive, massive army, which didn't make a ton of sense for an internal defense mission. So there were throwdowns on that, absolutely. But there was a willingness to confront those rather than just say, let's put those under the rug and then put a smiley face on when we talk to Congress. Thank you all so much for taking time away from your very busy day jobs to come. I really appreciate it.
Just a plug for our next event, and my TOC can tell me if there's an intermediate one, but July 16th in the Pentagon Auditorium, we'll have kind of a book launch about the history and evolution of the reserves, and it'll feature one of the authors, as well as General McCarthy and General Paterno, I think. So please join us in July, and we'll, of course, send out our usual advertisement. But thank you, Dr. Karlin, for a very cerebral, but as someone said, a very passionate discussion as well. Thank you. Thanks.